Okay, good evening, everyone. So we yesterday started discussing the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, a familiar story coming up to Tisha B'Av. A couple of extra points which we didn't get to last night I wanted to mention. So first of all, interesting point, where is, just a quick recap. I want to focus a little bit more on the second half of the story. Last time we spoke more about the first half, which is more familiar. Right, Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, we spoke about why Kamtza gets blamed, even though he's not even in the story at all. Doesn't appear, but this person had the dinner, had the feast, whatever it was. Bar Kamtza was the enemy, not the ally. He was invited by mistake. He gets embarrassed. He gets thrown out of the feast. He says, "I'll show them a lesson." And then he goes to the Roman emperor, says, "The Jews are rebelling against you. I'll prove it to you. Send them a korban, and they won't offer it up." They send it. He sends a korban. They don't offer it up because Bar Kamtza put a blemish. The Gemara tells us a blemish, a mum that was a mum for us, not a mum for them. And the rabbis discuss what to do. That's what we'll focus on a bit more tonight. So the rabbis are talking about it. And they say, again, maybe we should offer it up, even though it has a mum. Right? Maybe this, in order to, for the sake of pikuach nefesh, Gemara doesn't explicitly say pikuach nefesh. We'll talk about it. But they say, maybe we should do that. Says Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkulas, you can't offer it up. People will say that you can bring a korban with a mum. They say, okay, maybe Bar Kamtza is a roidef. Maybe he should be put to death, so that he can't go back and tell the Romans. Rabbi Zachariah says you can't kill him. Then people will say somebody who's matil mum b'kodshim, somebody who's puts a blemish in a sacrifice that is punishable by death, which it's not. Because of that, says the Gemara, Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkulos, because of the humility, because of the anava of Rabbi Zachariah. So the entire story happened. The Churban, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. We went into exile, etc. So somebody asked me yesterday, why wasn't there a third option? Why couldn't they just go and tell the Romans, this is thank you very much. You gave us this korban. It's got a mumin. We can't offer it up. I mean, that is not suggested by the Gemara. That is not suggested as an option. Maybe it's because the era of fake news goes back a long way. Maybe they were still choshesh that they would go and tell, but Bar Kamtza came along. He said, "You see, I told you they're just making excuses," and they wouldn't believe it. Because at the end of the day, they would say, "Where's the mum? What's the blemish? Show us." And that's why the Gemara says it's a blemish which, for their laws, doesn't count. It's not a blemish. They say, "Oh, you're making it up. You're just trying to get out of it," etc. So, very interesting. I asked somebody, where does the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, where is it mentioned explicitly in Shulchan Aruch and its commentaries? Well, the obvious answer you'll say is in Hilchot Tisha B'Av. That might be the case. One place where it does come up, we know on Tisha B'Av, unique halacha, which applies to this day, very unusual. So we aren't allowed to have regular Torah study because limud Torah is misameach lev, and Tisha B'Av is not a day when we are rejoicing or able to rejoice. Therefore, we aren't allowed to study, similar to when somebody is in Avelut. They're not allowed to study ordinary things. But there are certain sections that we can learn. The Agadot HaChurban, the Gemara in Masechet Gittin, including the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. That's one of the things. But it's interesting that the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza actually pops up in Hilchot Sukkot. Where does it come up in Hilchot Sukkot? Hilchot Lulav, Siman Taf Reish Nun Vav in the Shulchan Aruch. This is a siman that talks about how much a person has to spend on their etrog. And there's a din that talks about if a person has to go for a hidur mitzvah, you have an etrog for a etrog mehudar, which is very, very expensive. How much does a person have to overextend themselves in order to fulfill a mitzvah in a more mehudar way? So the Ramah over there mentions the following halacha. He says, let's say somebody is not able to get an etrog for a very, unless it's very expensive. He says, Misha eno etrog or shal mitzvah overet. Right, so it applies to this mitzvah or any other mitzvah, which is that why does he mention a mitzvah overet? Meaning there's a certain time limit. If I don't fulfill it now, I won't be able to fulfill it at all. Nonetheless, says the Ramah, we are not required to spend an exorbitant amount to fulfill the mitzvah. If it's more than a fifth of what would be regular, what is expected, that is not, one does not have to spend that money, and one would then be patur. Right? Afilu mitzvah averet. And then he says, Davka mitzvat aseh. That is when it comes to a mitzvat aseh, a positive mitzvah. That one is not required to spend more than a certain amount. Aval lo taseh, but if there is a negative mitzvah, there is a prohibition. It says, Yiten kol mamono kodem she'avo. So then the person should spend all, says the Rama, spend all your money in order to avoid this transgression. So the Mishnah Berurah over here explains. He says, right? Not fulfilling a mitzvah taseh is a problem. Obviously, you should fulfill the mitzvah taseh, but if you have not done it, you've lost out on that opportunity, but you've not done anything against Ratzon Hashem. You have not transgressed anything, which is not the same. And then he says, so that's the connection to our story. Now the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham says over here in this piece of the Shulchan Aruch, he says, Mashma Ktsat Begit in Daf Nun Vav, the Maaseh de Bar Kamtza. He says in the story of Bar Kamtza, we can learn, we can extrapolate. He says, Mashma Ktsat, the following halakha. That it would be permitted to transgress a lo taseh because of eimat malchut, because of fear of the kingship, fear of the government, as we saw in the story. Where do we see that in the story in the Gemara? Because the Rabbanan said, right, maybe we can go along and we can bring the korban anyway. It's a transgressing. You aren't allowed to bring a korban that is a bal mum, but because of the eimat malchut, because of the fear of what the malchut is going to do to us, which at the end of the day we see where it led. So the Magen Avraham learns from here. Perhaps you could say that you could be over on a mitzvat lo taseh. Because the problem is, that was the Havamina in the Gemara, but Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula said, no, that's not the case. You can't do it, and they didn't do it. So what it sounds like, how the Magen Avraham learns is that Rabbi Zechariah was wrong, that it would have been correct to have gone to one of those avenues the Rabbanan suggested. The Mishnah Berurah here continues. He says, he says, the other Achronim reject the Magen Avraham. Why? I say, in other words, the Magen Avraham is saying from the story, what was it there? Maybe he learns the following. Maybe he learns why they did not go ahead and do this, because it was not a case of pikuach nefesh, or at least they didn't realize, they didn't think it was a case of pikuach nefesh. They thought it was a case of, because eimat malchut, in terms of, and we know there are certain halachot, in terms of the things that are relaxed, in terms of animosity, in terms of eva coming from the ruling authority, not to the extent of pikuach nefesh. Therefore, they didn't do it. And he says, maybe even if it's not pikuach nefesh, we learn from here you could do it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, many achronim, many other authorities reject the Magen Avraham and say, yes, over there it would have been correct, and they could have brought this korban if they wanted to. But that's why. The reason is because there it was pikuach nefesh. There it was going to lead to saving of a life, which you would know. But all of that really just strengthens the question, which is, if this really was a case of pikuach nefesh, which is how the Achronim understand it, okay, and it's easy to say hindsight's always 20/20. Looking back, clearly it was pikuach nefesh, but that was the discussion going on at the time. The Rabbanan said, let's bring the korban, or let's kill Bar Kamtza because he's already dead. Either way, lives are at stake. Lives are under threat. This is sakanat nefashot, pikuach nefesh. Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula says, no, we can't do that. What are people going to say? So the question is, and again, the pshat seems to be that the Gemara does blame Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula, that he was wrong. But the question is, what was he thinking? What was Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula thinking? Why not? This is not Gilui Arayot or Shvichut Damim or Avodah Zarah. This is not one of the cardinal sins, right? Bringing a korban with a mum. Why didn't they answer him back and say, Rabbi Zechariah, people can say whatever they want to say, but this is pikuach nefesh and it's tocheh. Right? That's the question. That's the question that really is begged when we look at this Gemara. So one answer, which Rav Chanan Wasserman suggests, which I have to say I don't fully understand the answer, but this is what he says. Also, it's difficult because when you look in the Gemara, again, there are two things going on. It seems to be he doesn't come back and say, you're not allowed to bring a korban with that's got a mum. He says people will say afterwards that you're allowed to bring a korban with mum. In other words, I agree with you that actually doing that ma'aseh itself is allowed because of pikuach nefesh, but because of the fact of what it looks like and what people will say afterwards, that it won't be allowed. So you can actually transgress the mitzvah because of pikuach nefesh, but the fact that people will say and I want to understand, why won't they understand? Just tell them it was pikuach nefesh. It's very, very strange. So Hanuman Wasserman says in Kovetz Harot, he says that when it comes to this action right now would have been pikuach nefesh, in other words, doing this. But later on, it would have led to people later on going and bringing a korban with the mum, doing the same action in a situation that is not pikuach nefesh. Again, I don't fully understand why and what the difference should be, right? What it's going to lead to later. Right now, it's pikuach nefesh. Why can't you do it? That's what it says. Tzarich iyun. That we can look that up in Rav Chana. But another answer, and this is the answer of Chaim Shmulevitz gives. Shiva Avmir says this in Sichot Musar. He says the following. He says, Pikuach Nefesh comes along. Pikuach Nefesh is doche nearly the entire Torah. Pikuach Nefesh suspends nearly every one of the 613 mitzvot. That's when I'm transgressing that mitzvah, or transgressing that aveira in order to save a life. Right? This is masim b'chol yom, eating on Yom Kippur, traveling on Shabbat, etc. He says when it is going to when we're talking about not just transgressing a mitzvah, but you're talking about uprooting the Torah. When you're talking about creating a distortion of the Torah itself, then that does not apply. We do not have license to go and to uproot and to uproot, to nullify, to distort the Torah. He says, what was Rabbi Kenigsberg ben Avkula saying? That's what it means when it says people will say that you're allowed to do this, which is against the Torah. People will say that you can do this, say you can do that. The halakha will be lost. It will be distorted. It's not just this action now, but forevermore in all generations, people are going to do the wrong thing. People are going to lose. You're uprooting certain mitzvot of the Torah. You're distorting it to such a degree. He says that was what he held. That was Rabbi Zechariah's svara, that was not doche pikuach nefesh. So says Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz. He learns from a Gemara Bava Kama that talks about two Roman officers who were learning Torah. They came along and they said, teach us the Torah. So the Chachamim said, okay, it was for the sake to prevent them from being killed. They did. And this is brought in the Gemara Bava Kama under the dinim of Nezikim, of the shiur. It brings a certain case that says that these two Roman officers came, they learned the whole Torah, and they said, your Torah is true, we're convinced by everything, except for there's one halakha which we can't accept. And it's got to do, won't get into the technicalities now, but it's a certain case when you have a shiur of a Jew and you have one of a non-Jew, and a certain case where the non-Jew would have to pay and the Jew would not have to pay. So they say, no, that we can't. So asks the Marashal, says if they were teaching them the Torah for the sake of pikuach nefesh, why could, right? And they were going to get upset by the fact there's certain halachot, there's distinction between Jew and non-Jew. We know that there are certain halachot. We say mipnei iva and mipnei darkei shalom, etc. Why couldn't they just have taught them in a different way? So he says no over there because you don't have the heter to go and distort the Torah. You don't have the heter to go and change it, etc. So that was potentially what the idea of Rabbi Kenigsberg ben Avkula was. That's how Rav Chaim Shmulevitz explains. What did he still get wrong? Because at the end of the day, he was not correct. At the end of the day, we see this leads to the Churban, and it didn't happen. So Rav Nemenza, we've quoted Rav Nemenza a lot recently over the past week. He said the following idea. He says that essentially, Rabbi Zechariah says, Pikuach Nefesh would suspend a certain mitzvah here, a certain mitzvah there. It does not suspend uprooting the entire Torah. He says what this led to, by having the Churban and by going into Galut, that was a much greater uprooting of the Torah. That was a much greater distortion of halakha than what would have happened in this point anecdotally. It says the Gemara in Chagiga says, from the time that Am Yisrael went into Galut, that is the greatest bitul Torah that exists. Why? Because until that point, here we have all the sages are together in one place. All the sages are sitting together. There's a doubt, there's a new situation that arises, there's a machloket, there's a question in halakha. Everybody can sit together, we can solve it, and we can figure out what the answer is. But you go into Galut, and the Jewish world is dispersed in the four corners of the globe, and you have Rashi sitting in France, and you have the Rif sitting in Spain, and you have the Rambam where he is, and the Ramban, and you have later on. You have the Torah becomes not just two Torahs, not just three Torahs, it becomes 100 different Torahs. Everybody has a different tradition. That unity of tradition becomes lost. And there are machlokot, and there's no communication between the different sages in different places. And in one place, the halakha is like this, and in one place, the halakha is like that, and you have other communities that are cut off, and that is a much greater uprooting of Torah than what would have been if there was one halakha which was misinterpreted. And therefore, he says that was the greater mistake, and therefore Rabbi Zechariah was wrong, and therefore that was not something that they should have done. Just to share one more insight of the Vilna Gaon. There's a fascinating insight on this story again, because the Gemara tells us all this happened because of anava of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkula. Normally we look at anava as a positive quality. anava, humility. We strive to be. And Moshe Rabbeinu, and there was no anav greater than him. Why is anava looked at here as a negative quality? The answer is that anava, sometimes there's a place of false humility. Sometimes there's a place where a person, rather than, we spoke about it briefly last night, rather than taking responsibility and recognizing one's place, chooses that anava instead, and that can lead to disastrous consequences. Says the Vilna Gaon, the way that it worked was this. He says, when the Sanhedrin was trying a capital case, you went from each of the judges, each of the Dayanim had to give their opinion. You start with the most junior, you end up with the most senior. Why? Because if the most senior judge, the most senior Dayan is going to give his opinion first, who's going to dare to argue with him? Right? So everybody, you start from the most junior, everybody gives their opinion, and then the Rebbe says, and then the Rebbe says, and then the Rebbe says. So he says Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulos was actually the greatest of them. But he, in his humility, didn't recognize that, and he thought that he was the lowliest. So he started off, he gave his answer first. Once Rabbi Zechariah says what he says, who's going to argue with him? So because of that, and again, you look at the Gemara, if the Gemara is blaming Rabbi Zechariah, when he said what he said, why didn't they outvote him? Because they saw him as more senior. They saw him as greater in Chokhmah. And if he said no, so okay, we're going to listen. No one's going to go after that and rule against him. So that's the Vilna Gaon. That is the anavah, the anavah psula, which led to those unfortunate and disastrous consequences at that time. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha, Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu zakot et Yisrael, v'chach b'alem Torah mitzvot, shneimar Adonai chafetz man tzidko, yagdil Torah v'yadil.